So this is going to be a little bit high level, and I apologize for that. But kind of the motivation behind this presentation is, everybody says that sports analytics is very important, but there's still a lot of skepticism about whether or not that can work in a sport like soccer. So I kind of wanted to go through kind of the state of affairs, what's been going on in soccer, why there is this skepticism, and kind of what we're doing to maybe have some advances in the field and get rid of some of the skepticism. So just a little bit of background. As Stuart said, my background is computer science. I spent most of my professional career working at Microsoft Bing. So we were working with petabytes of data. So this is large-scale sports analytics, so that's a good fit. And it's not as much of a departure from working at a search engine to working on sports analytics as I thought. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what makes good search results. So this is kind of turning a subjective judgment into something that's objective and that you can measure and you can kind of improve. So if you think about trying to identify like who are the good soccer players that you would want for your team, it's very similar. Another thing that I worked on was personalization, so adding context to different searches. So if you think about, when you're doing searches, you're not always just looking for one thing and then moving on. A lot of times you're doing searches for different things over time, and the system can learn things about you. So if I start looking for, Steven Gerrard, Jimmy Traore, Adam Lallana, these are all players of Liverpool Football Club. If I then do a search for Liverpool, the system should know that I mean Liverpool Football Club and not Liverpool, the city, looking for tourism. So that's kind of the thing that we were looking at. And this relates to sports analytics as well, because a lot of time we're not just looking at the event that occurred, but the build up to that. How did that event come to be? So that's kind of the relationship there. Okay, so a little bit about StatDNA. So I joined early 2012, and at the time they were just a small soccer analytics company. They owned their entire data pipeline, so complete vertical integration. They collected their own data, provided analytics reports on top of that, and linked everything to video. And at the time, our clients were mostly teams from small leagues, Brazil, Mexico, a lot of US colleges, but we also had a deal with Arsenal. They liked us so much that they decided to acquire us in 2013, and that's really changed a lot of things for us. We now have access to a whole lot of data that we weren't privy to before. So we help them completely on the sporting side, nothing on the business side yet. But we help them with recruitment, opposition analysis, sports science, trying to keep the players fit, healthy, and performing at an optimal level. So when we talk about sports analytics in soccer, the data we typically are referring to is events-based data. So this is anything related to how the ball is moving, who's trying to move the ball, and defensively, anybody who's trying to actively win the ball back. And there's a company called Opta. They're the biggest provider. So when you see people have like these little chalkboards or diagrams, typically they're getting their data from Opta. But there are other companies out there who are doing similar things. So like I mentioned, StatDNA, we were competing with Opta. We were collecting our own data. And so one thing to note is that these definitions of events and what constitutes a pass versus a shot versus a cross, there's no standard. So everybody has their own definitions, and so a lot of times data isn't necessarily comparable across different data providers. Teams often collect their own additional data. So sometimes this will be something subjective. It's typically things that they think are important to their own sporting success, their KPIs that they want to track. And it's usually difficult to collect on a large scale. So they'll collect it for their own team and maybe their opposition for a few games, for the upcoming match, but nothing too large. But it's very interesting data. And then we have this XY tracking data that I'll talk about a little bit later. Again, there's multiple providers in the space. They're all using, different number of cameras, different frame rate, different precision. This has been around in soccer for, I think, 20 years. It's quite old, but there's not been a ton of work in this area. It's been hard to get access to this data. Even the teams themselves couldn't get the raw data from some of the providers. But this allows you to get the full context of what's going on. All right, so I wanted to go through a few quotes from various people within the game talking about soccer analytics and what they think of it. So this is Bruce Arena. He is the manager of the LA Galaxy. Full disclosure, I live in Seattle, so they're like one of our big rivals, so he's not my favorite person. But he said this a couple weeks ago. He said, "We won the game. Then some moron will write that they had more shots than us, thinking that's important. Actually, analytics in soccer, if no one here has figured it out, doesn't mean a whole lot." And so this is like a pretty damning quote coming from someone who was, the head coach of our national team for quite a while, went to a couple World Cups. It's kind of a bit of a disappointment that he feels that way, but okay. This is another quote. This is from a year ago. It's somebody writing about a system called My Coach, which was put out by Adidas. They were trying to quantify soccer intelligence. And they say, creativity, subtlety, artistry. Can you have soccer without those qualities? Unfortunately, yes. Yes, you can. And without them, a pretty dismal sport soccer becomes. In effect, a soulless sport dominated by metrics, which deal only with facts. So he's kind of talking about this antagonism between the beautiful game and quantifying it, and there's really no place in soccer for this quantification. And then this is a great quote from Charles Barkley. I don't think you can talk about sports analytics these days without bringing this quote up. He's actually talking about basketball, but I think if you asked him, he would say it applies to all sports. He says, analytics don't work at all. It's just some crap that people who are really smart made up to try to get in the game because they had no talent. Thanks, Charles. Okay, so are these people wrong? Not entirely, right? I mean, Charles Barkley is entirely wrong, but the other two do have a bit of truth to what they're getting at, and I can kind of see why they would feel that way, and I think it's a bit unfortunate. So why are there so many haters? Well, it's a fluid sport, right? Unlike sports where there has been a lot of very public success, like baseball, where there's a very defined beginning to a play, end to a play. It's pitcher versus batter. You know what's going on. Soccer is much more fluid, much more dynamic. A lot of times it's difficult to even determine who has the ball, who's in possession. There's kind of these uncontrolled states. It's very low scoring. So this leads to a lot of randomness. The best team doesn't always win. And so people kind of inherently object to quantifying something where they feel like it's just random. So how can you quantify and predict randomness? This also makes my life very difficult because it means that the data is very sparse in some things. So there's a nice poster about three-point shots where I think they got 20,000 samples from one season. You'll never see that many shots in a soccer season at all. That would take us years to collect. And that's not even talking about goals, right? So another thing, off the ball movement is really, really important in soccer. So anyone who's played the game will recognize you spend very little time with the ball, a lot of time without the ball, and what you're doing without the ball is just as crucial as what you do with the ball. And so with a lot of this event-based data, that's not necessarily being picked up. And so people say, well, you're not giving credit to the guy who made the run that allowed that to happen. And then bad metrics are easy. And this one, I think this is my personal pain point. I hate to see this, and I think this really explains why so many people are still skeptical. Okay, so let's talk about Charles Reap. So has anyone in this room heard of Charles Reap before? Okay, so a couple people. So he's kind of the grandfather of soccer statistics. I think he was a Air Force pilot, something. But he would collect his own data via pen and paper all the way back in the 1950s. So way before we had computers, way before we had camera tracking systems, RFID, anything like that. And so he's kind of credited with the invention of the long ball, or at least with getting the English national team to play a long ball style. And so how this came about was that he studied the patterns that led to goal scoring opportunities and to actual goals. And what he found was that most goals came from pass sequences that were incredibly short, less than 3 passes. So he said, guys, the more you pass the ball, the more likely you are to lose it. Let's get the ball as close to goal as quickly as possible, and then we can just get it right in there, right? Just hoof it up there. So if you guys know who this is Pep Guardiola. He's the current manager of Manchester City. He's highly regarded as one of the best managers in the world, and he's known for kind of a possession-based style. And so his teams have historically been like some of the best ever, playing exactly the opposite way that Charles Reap had prescribed. And so how do you kind of reconcile, like, wait a second, these guys are really successful at doing the opposite, but Charles Reap had data that backed up his, conclusions. Where did things go wrong? And so fortunately, he was a nice man and he published his work, so we can go back and we can look at his methodology. And so basically what this is saying is that count up the number of passes that either lead to a shot, lead to losing the ball, turning it over to the other team, or there's some sort of infringement, right? And so you count the number of passes, and then you look at, okay, how many passes were there before this shot or this goal? And so you can see, like, kind of makes sense, except for this whole concept of an infringement. And so if you think about, well, what's an infringement in soccer? That's going to be offside. Okay, so you turn the ball back over to the other team. That's fine. But what about, like, when it goes out of bounds for a corner kick and you get a set piece, or there's a foul leading to a dangerous free kick or a penalty? And so in soccer, a lot of goals are actually scored that way. I think it's probably about 20 to 30% of goals, depending, would come from these kind of set pieces, and those would all be credited in his system as 0, 1, or 2 pass data points. And so what he's done is, by coming up with this kind of weird definition of possession, he's biased his own data set. And he doesn't really go into, how did you get that free kick? How did you get that corner? How did you win that penalty? And so, a lot of possession can come way before that, but it's being completely thrown out. So, we're talking about it's easy to come up with bad metrics. Something as simple as defining, like, what is a possession, when does possession begin, when does possession end, can have really big implications and ramifications if you don't do it correctly. All right, so let's go back to Bruce Arena. So his quote was, "Some moron will write that they had more shots than us, thinking that's important." So what is he talking about? And he's talking about this concept called shot dominance, total shot ratio. There's a whole bunch of names for it. But the idea is that teams that shoot more than their opponents are going to win. And in fact, like, it's kind of true. It's loosely correlated with winning. Only in England, and the correlation seems to be weakening as playing styles change, right? But it's still kind of this popular concept. So why doesn't this sit well with Bruce Arena? So let's take a look at a quote of his from all the way back in 2001. So this is 15 years ago. He says, "It was a good performance. We had solid ball movement at times, and we created good chances," right? So he's not saying we created a lot of chances or we created more chances than the other team. He's saying we created good chances, right? So he has this inherent concept of chance quality that he, as a coach, has internalized, but maybe he doesn't have the words to accurately describe it. I couldn't find a good quote for this, but one thing that's kind of famous in Bruce Arena's teams is that they're not always actively trying to score. So one thing he likes to do is, particularly away from home, play very defensively, wait for the opportunity to maybe get an early goal, and then sit back and really defend, absorb pressure from the other team, and hold on to the win. So he's trying to kill off the game, not actively trying to score. And when you're doing that, you would expect the other team to take more shots than you, and you're not going to take too many risks and try to score yourself. So as a coach, he knows that, and so he says, that's not a good metric. And just us as people who read about sports analytics, we know that counting isn't a great idea, right? Like, this is a concept that has kind of been proven to be not a good idea in a lot of other sports. So you wouldn't judge a baseball team on the number of pitches that they threw or the number of hits. I think pretty early on, somebody thought hits was important. That's why it's included in the box score. but nobody really says, oh, good, we out-hit them today. What a good team. OK, so we're going to play a little game called Who Scored. So this kind of will drive home the concept of shot quality or chance quality if you're not already convinced. So I just went into our database, and I found a whole bunch of shots that I thought were interesting. And I want you guys to tell me whether or not somebody's going to score. OK, so he's about to take a shot. Who thinks he's going to score from here? One person. OK. A couple people. All right. The majority say no. And in fact, the crowd actually does like mock jeers when he takes that shot. So this is the same player. You can see kind of the defense pushing him around, pushing him to the outside. He gets the ball back. Who thinks he's going to score from here? More people. OK. No, keeper's got it covered. He's not going to score from there, guys. All right, so here's another one. Who thinks he's going to score from here? OK, more people. Good. Yeah, so it's an easy tap in. You better score from there. We pay him a lot of money. I didn't pause it, but he scored. It was a more difficult chance, but he got it. Shoot. Sorry. Stupid video. OK, so those were like pretty obvious. These next two shots, they're kind of taken from the same location. So I want you to think about like kind of the context that's going on. So who thinks he's going to score from here? OK, good number of people. No. But it's a decent one. So unfortunately, they're going the opposite side of the field. But trust me, the shot is from a somewhat similar location. So who thinks he's going to score now? Right, a lot more people. So he doesn't score. But you would have expected him more often than not. Like, he would be more likely to score from that example than the previous one, right? And so what these are kind of demonstrating is this concept called expected goals. Again, there's a lot of different names for this metric. But all we're doing here is quantifying the likelihood that a shot results in a goal. So I went into our database, and I said, get me some really bad shots. Get me some really good shots. And then get me a good and bad shot from each location. And so you can kind of see that where the early shots, they're taken from distance, completely packed. Defense, probably not going to score. The middle shots, they're all taken from incredibly close range with the keeper out of position. It's not perfect because the one where I forgot to pause it, he has to like back heel it in. So it was a little bit of a tricky finish, but he gets it in there. And then those last two, they're taken from the same location. But one of them, he's completely alone with the goalkeeper. The other one, he has literally a wall of players in front of him blocking the goal. So it's really important to take in a lot of these other factors. So we've built a model. Because we own our own data pipeline, we can collect some of these factors that we think are important. We've built a model that incorporates them. It's just a simple logistic regression, but it works well for us. But what this kind of does is now it starts to encapsulate some of those things that people are complaining about. So we're looking at the build-up to the goal. So this concept of fluidity, we're bringing that into the model. And if you have off-the-ball movement that's quite good, like Alexis Sanchez does, like Jamie Vardy does, then that can impact some of these features. So you'll start to see them showing up in these kind of dangerous situations more often than not. And so there's actually a really good paper on this called Quality versus Quantity, Improved Shot Prediction in Soccer Using Strategic Features from Spatial Temporal Data. So you might recognize some of the names at the bottom. This was presented at the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference a couple years ago. So if you're interested in learning more about expected goals and one of the way you can do it using kind of the rich XY tracking data, it's a great paper to check out. Okay, so creativity. So this is another great quote. I found this from some random person on the internet when we got acquired. He said, "Stats can't tell you when Santi Cazorla picks out the perfect pass and splits two defenders." So this was personally offensive to me because I think this is exactly what we're supposed to do. We're not just counting the number of passes that Santi has, but we want to tell you when he can pick out a good pass. So just like there's quality versus quantity in shots, there is for passes, but it's a lot harder because there's a lot more context that needs to go into it. So I looked at our database again, and I said, Santi, give me all your good passes. And I found this was the fifth shot, or fifth pass I came across. So that's Santi receiving the ball there, literally splits two defenders, right? So we can figure this out for you. Okay, so, that's nice. It's a good example, but did Santi do the right thing there? That's kind of the next level that we're missing. What were his passing options? So if we look at this video again, I want you to look at the top of the screen, and you'll see there's another runner over there who wasn't between two defenders. So maybe that was a better option because he would have been alone rather than just relying on pace to beat those two defenders. So that's one of the things where kind of the tracking data can come in and help us, but we're not quite there yet. Okay, so let's talk about the tracking data for a little bit. So like I said, historically, a lot of the stats have been based on the events data, but we're now transitioning into using this tracking data. It's been around for a really long time, but very limited number of people have had access to it. But now there is a data sharing agreement between the EPL teams, very similar to what you have in the NBA. So you're now able to get a very rich data set. So previously, even if you had had access to the XY tracking data, it would have only been for your team. So this is kind of like a big deal for us. So the data, it's kind of big. It's not quite petabytes of data, but we're talking about now 5 million data points for a single game versus roughly 2,000 events. And so over the course of a season, you're talking about 1.9 billion data points. And it's very raw data. So we do get the location of the ball, we get the location of the players, the referees, but no context to go with it other than when the halves begin and end. So this is the DIKW pyramid. I don't know if everyone is familiar with it. Hopefully you are. But it's just kind of the different stages of what you can do with data. So at the very bottom is your raw data. Then you have information, which is like what is going on. Then your knowledge, which is the how-to. And then your wisdom, like why, what is best. So our job is really to help our coaching staff create wisdom and use wisdom. So we have to basically transform this data into knowledge so that they can then take it, incorporate it into their game plan, their squad selection, their transfers, and really kind of use their wisdom to do the right things. So the event data, in a way, is actually already information. It's not always great information, but at least it's some information. It's a shot. A shot happened here by this player, which is nice. And then we have to kind of do a lot more work to turn it into knowledge, but at least it's there. But with the tracking data, we've now regressed back down to raw data. And so it's really hard to work with because you have to do a lot just to get back to kind of this level of context of the event data. So kind of talking about that, I'll walk you through one of the simple metrics that we have and kind of all of the steps that are involved with going just from data back to information. So we have this metric. It's called distance between the lines, and it's a measure of team compactness. So if you're not familiar with soccer, a lot of times teams will defend with a row of defenders and a row of midfielders, and you want to keep them mostly all behind the ball so the other team can't get in behind you, like Jamie Vardy did in that goal, get one-on-one with the keeper, right? And so more specifically, our definition is we want to calculate the distance between the average position of the center backs, the 2 or 3, however many you're using, and the average position of the 2 deepest midfielders. So Arsenal tend to play with kind of 2 holding midfielders and 1 attacking midfielder, so that's why we chose the deepest one. But you'll see a lot of teams have a similar shape when they're out of possession with the ball. So because we only care about 1 dimension, we're literally taking the average of 2 numbers twice and then subtracting them. So this is like 5th grade math, right? Like this is really easy. No linear algebra, no calculus, no matrix factorization, nothing. All right, so here's an example from one of our internal tools that's just kind of rendering the tracking data. So you'll probably have seen similar visualizations in basketball where we have these little moving dots. So I just took a snapshot and I filtered out the opposing team. So you can see we have a really, really nice shape here. So the yellow dots, we've color-coded them because those are our defenders. And they're in a really nice straight line. That's exactly what we want to see. Not too far in front of them is a really nice green line of our midfielders, right? And then kind of slightly above the line is our attacking midfielder, Mesut Ozil, who's not so good at defending. And then at the top is our center forward, Olivier Giroud. He's getting ready in case the ball turns over. He's ready to run at the defenders, right? But this is exactly what we want to see, 2 banks of 4. So it's very easy to calculate this number. You can see we take the average position of number 16 and number 20, and we subtract it from the average position of 4 and 6. Perfect. 4 and 6 are our center backs, Per Mertesacker and Laurent Koscielny, and 20 is Mathieu Flamini, 16 is Aaron Ramsey. Okay, so this is great. But when would we really care about this number? It's when things get messy, right? Like we would want to know when things get messy, like things go pear-shaped. And so one of the problems with that is like when your team is out of position, players aren't necessarily where they're nominally supposed to be. So maybe your center backs get drawn out of position or whatnot. So we'll look at an example. So this is from last year. It's late in the game, and we're defending a 2-1 lead against a very poor Sunderland side at home. We've not been playing very well, and we've had some injuries to key midfielders. So our midfield pair are 2 guys that aren't really used to each other and maybe are a little bit not complementary to each other. So this is a screenshot from one of the analysis programs in England called Monday Night Football. And you can see this huge circle that they highlighted where there's just like a gaping hole where our midfield should be. So late in the game, this is exactly what you wouldn't want to see. And the little halo at the bottom is our manager pointing to that hole and saying, please, someone get in there. So this was really bad. So my boss said to me, would we have picked this up? Would we have identified this as a bad situation? So before we get to that, let's see how this plays out. All right, so that's our left back bombing forward. Gets the ball. Kind of a little glitch there, but through some miracle, we actually score, right? So the team doesn't get punished for this. And a lot of times in post-match analysis, this might get glanced over. It might be forgotten in the fog of war. Say, hey, we got the late goal. What's the big deal? But really, if we do this again, we're going to get punished. If we do this against a much better team, we're going to get punished. So we want to know when this happens, we can go back to the players and say, stop doing that, right? So this is what it looks like. And you can see there is a much bigger distance between the lines. It's actually 39.43 meters. But the interesting thing here is that it took us a lot of work to actually calculate this correctly. So before we were taking the difference between 4 and 6 at the background. Now it's 4 and 20. So what's happened here is our defensive midfielder has dropped into the back line, and he's playing like a center back. And so if we want to calculate this number correctly, we need to say he's playing like a center back. He's not playing like a midfielder. And then our other center back has now shifted over to the left, because remember, our left back went bombing forward. So he's all the way, at the top of the screen. So this guy has come over to shield, kind of cover for him. Our other midfielder is the goal scorer. So he's all the way up at the top of the screen as well. So if we had kind of just left everyone in their nominal positions and said, let's take the difference of 16 and 20, the line would have been about 10 or 15 meters in front of the defenders, and everything would have looked great. Like, no problem, guys. Like, that's great. But because we had to kind of like reassign people to their effective roles or their effective positions, we're able to illuminate the problem here. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that. And again, there's another good paper. Stuart Morgan and Patrick Lucy, I believe, did one on field hockey rules. Is that right? Yeah. So we use kind of a different algorithm. We just use a rules-based expert system, but it works well for us. But it was a lot of work to get that to work well before we can even start doing these really simple distance calculations, right? But then we have this other problem, is that we've moved from this kind of discrete event-based metrics to now this almost streaming data that's happening all the time throughout a game. So if you want to kind of give a metric to somebody, you have to figure out, like, when does it make sense to calculate that? Like, you don't want to just give them the average distance for the whole game. That doesn't make sense. You have to kind of think about, when does it make sense? So do you want separate numbers for in versus out of possession? You expect your team shape to be slightly different in those two scenarios. What about set pieces? Do you filter those out? At what point does a set piece transition back to being kind of regular play? So that's another thing that you need to think about, is what are the phases of play? How do I identify these phases of play so that I can calculate this metric? What do you do with stoppages when a player goes down injured or the ball goes out of bounds? How do you kind of deal with those? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? And then what about transitions when you kind of are moving from in possession to out of possession? So once you figure that out, then you have to figure out, how am I actually going to give this to our coaching staff? Like, do they want averages? Do they want a distribution? What's the worst case? What's the best case? Or do we just simply want to look at the number of times we exceed some sort of predetermined threshold? All right, so it's not just as simple as fifth grade math. There's a lot more to it, which is why this is kind of slow moving. Okay, so other difficulties that we've kind of run into using this tracking data and how we're kind of overcoming them. So the data is big and slow. Like, yes, you can fit a single game into memory, but it'll take a long time if you're just doing everything on a single machine. So we've started using Spark and the Hadoop ecosystem. So now we have like a nice big scalable cluster that's had its own issues with it. And if you're curious about that, you can talk to me afterwards. But I think, the other thing is that we're starting to scale as well. So yes, there's tracking data for the EPL. There might be data for other leagues, and so now you're talking about 2, 4, 6 billion data points per season. It's really hard to debug models, as Peter was kind of talking about in his talk. You're looking at kind of these raw moving points. We're kind of the opposite because we're not deriving or calculating this data. We want to derive insights from it. So we actually want to look at the video and link everything to video and see, what is the model doing based on what we think is happening. So in order to come up with that passing model that can detect whether or not Santi Cazorla can split two defenders, like, we looked at a lot of video to make sure, like, not only is goodness of fit really good, but it makes sense from a sporting aspect. We're doing a lot of different things to kind of help speed up the agility of deploying like data science models. So we've played around with using Docker containers and kind of data science as a service. So exposing our models as an API that we can easily swap in and out of a lot of our video infrastructure. And we've actually been playing around with like this new feature in SQL Server where you can just pop in an R model into SQL Server and call it via a stored procedure. So that's just another way that we can kind of easily deploy models to our test environments and watch the video and see what's going on. Another big issue we have is that these insights need to be actionable. So with this distance between the lines, that's something that's very easily coachable, and you can tell the players about it. And so that's great. Some of the things we deal with are not so kind of easily understandable. So we need to keep our models very simple, and sometimes we actually have to forego the best model for the simplest model that the coaching staff can understand and that we can explain to them. And so that really helps us build trust with the coaching staff when we can go to them and say, you know, when this happens, the model behaves this way. When this happens, the model behaves that way. And then we sit down with them and we watch a ton of video together, because that's kind of the common language here, right? Like, if we watch the video, they can point out things to us where, oh, that's a hole in the model, or your model's not accounting for that. Or we can show them, like, yes, our model is working well because, look, you can see it with your eyes. So it's a lot better than showing them, you know, area under the curve or anything like that. Yeah, so that's kind of all I have. Kind of end abruptly, but if you guys have any questions, you know, thank you for your time, and you can also follow up with me. It's my email address.